In a special message to mark the 60th anniversary of her accession to the throne, the Queen has said she's deeply moved by the support for her Diamond Jubilee.
It's 60 years to the day since King George VI died and Princess Elizabeth became Queen at the age of just 25. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
In her accession day message, the Queen, who's pictured in 2 special Diamond Jubilee photographs published today, expresses her gratitude for what she calls the wonderful support and encouragement that she and her husband have received over the past 60 years. She says they've been deeply moved by the many kind messages about the Diamond Jubilee. She goes on, "In this special year, as I dedicate myself anew to your service, I hope we will all be reminded of the power of togetherness and the convening strength of family, friendship and good neighbourliness." The Queen, who attended church yesterday at Sandringham, also says this Jubilee year is a time to give thanks for the great advances that have been made since 1952, and as we join together in the Diamond Jubilee, to look forward to the future with what she calls a clear head and a warm heart. It's a declaration of intent from a monarch 60 years on the throne who remains as committed as ever to the fulfilment of her duty. Later this week she'll return to Buckingham Palace, where the planning for the Diamond Jubilee programme of events is continuing apace. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News at Sandringham.
Well, the young Princess Elizabeth was staying in the Treetops Lodge in Kenya when she learned of the death of her father. Let's cross now to our correspondent Will Ross, who joins us from there this morning. Morning, Will.
Good morning. Yes, a very special spot. This not far from Mount Kenya, and of course extraordinary history right here. Behind me is the very spot where a tree house was located back in 1952. Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip stayed in that treehouse. We understand they spent many hours on a viewing platform looking down at a large watering hole, at large herds of elephant and buffalo and rhinoceros also came down to the watering hole, and they enjoyed that time. Now, of course, this place has such history because of what happened on that night of the 5th of February. We know that the princess and prince went to bed that night, and as the princess went up the steps, of course, she was still a princess. She then wouldn't have known, but during the night, her father died back in England, King George VI. So when she came down the steps in the morning, she came down a queen. So that's the extraordinary history about this particular place. And we understand that when they were here, they then spent several hours driving back to a town called Nyeri, and it was later that they found out that King George VI had died.
Well, for the moment, thanks very much. Will Ross joining us from Kenya. Now, as we've been telling you, exactly 60 years ago today, the young Princess Elizabeth was on a visit to Kenya with her husband.
The couple were staying at the remote Treetops Hotel when news came that her father, King George VI, had died, and that meant she became Queen.
His death at the relatively young age of 56 touched many people. One of them was Margaret Lavender, who was a schoolgirl at the time.
We were quite sad because being 13, we'd grown up with the king being the king and the queen being the queen. We saw already the newspapers out, you know, black-edged, the king is dead. We had a television, 9-inch screen. We watched things on there in the succeeding days. Even when we went to the cinema to see the newsreels, it was still black and white. I know they had everything they could want, more than everybody had, but even so, the king was only 56. It was sad. Everybody, you know, was thinking, oh, what's going to happen? What a glamorous princess has now become queen, but what a burden to put on her at her age. It was quite an event, something that you don't forget. And it's so long ago.
60 years.
Thoughts of Margaret Lavender. Much more on that coming up later in the program. As we've been saying, 60 years ago today, the young Princess Elizabeth, who was 25 years old, was on holiday with her husband in Kenya.
But on February the 6th, 1952, an event took place which was to change her life forever. Her father, King George VI, died at the age of just 56, and as his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, became Queen.
Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell looks back at the events of that day and the impact around the world.
This is London.
It was an announcement which stunned the nation.
It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
Unknown to the British people and to members of his family, King George VI had been suffering from lung cancer. His death at the age of only 56 was a shocking blow to a country which was still struggling to recover from the traumas of the Second World War.
The heart of the nation stops. The flags lower in tribute. Over the Mother of Parliaments, high over Big Ben, the flag is low as the news spreads. The King is dead. The King, our King, is no more with us. Swift from the press, the news flows to the farthest corners of our island. In our hearts we feel, this cannot be.
On the day the King died, Alastair Donald Campbell was 10. He was at school. A Frenchman, a veteran of World War I, was taking a French class.
Halfway through that class, one of the other staff came in and whispered something into the teacher's ear. Suddenly we were conscious that this grown man sitting in front of us was crying, which for a child of our generation and in the 1950s, you didn't often see grown men, especially in public, expressing emotion of that kind. He recovered himself. He slowly walked to the chalkboard and wrote the words, "Le roi est mort, vive la reine." And that was how I learnt the news of King George VI's death.
At the moment of George VI's death, the throne passed to his elder daughter Elizabeth. She was in Kenya at the time. On learning the news, she returned to London to be greeted by the then Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. The new Queen was just 25 years old. On her shoulders rested the country's hopes and expectations.
One of the things we were conscious of was that the new Queen heralded, if you like, a new Elizabethan era, but that she was also very young for a monarch to succeed at that time.
But despite her youth, the Queen accepted her destiny. At her accession and then at her coronation, she committed her life to the service of Britain and the other countries of which she is monarch. And 60 years after she came to the throne, that commitment remains undimmed. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
And you've been sending us some of your memories, those of you who can remember at the time. Carol Rees said she was 9 at Newport Road School in Leighton. They had morning assembly. The headmaster came into the classroom and whispered to the teacher. Mr. Cook was wearing a black tie and whispered to my friend, "Someone's died." We were all called into the school and the announcement was made and most of us cried.
Jim in Gosport says it reminds him of the 1953 coronation when he was 12. They all caught the underground and stood there on the Mall, and his dad bought newspaper after newspaper because it was raining to shelter under, and afterwards making their way back home. The streets were ankle deep in sodden newspapers because everybody had thought the same thing. Thank you very much for your thoughts this morning. Keep them coming in.
Exactly 60 years ago today, the young Princess Elizabeth was on a visit to Kenya with her husband.
Well, the couple was staying at the remote Treetops Hotel when news came through that her father, King George VI, had died.
His death at the relatively young age of 56 touched many people. One of them was Joan Sargent, who was a schoolgirl.
We were at school and the headmistress called an assembly and told us the king had died, and a number of the girls started crying. I think people were genuinely concerned that the king had died. But we had this lovely princess, and I actually saw her coming back from Kenya. She looked very sad, but very composed, very regal, I suppose you'd say. The king was lying in state. We went one February night, and cold, it was utterly freezing. And we queued and queued, and eventually we went in. It was very solemn inside. It was awesome. I think for the country it was a special time. There was an expectation. We're going into this new Elizabethan era.
Long live the Queen.
Do you know, in the previous 60 years to Queen Elizabeth becoming queen, there were 5 different monarchs.
Gosh.
Yeah.
There we are.
There you are.
Thank you for your thoughts as well. You just heard Joan Sargent's. More of that to come. Now it's exactly 60 years to the day since King George VI died and Princess Elizabeth became Queen.
And to mark the formal start of the Diamond Jubilee year, the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery are going to perform a special salute in London today. Our reporter Richard Slee is at the barracks in St John's Wood, where the horses are being prepared. Morning, Richard.
Good morning. Yes, 109 horses being very thoroughly prepared here this morning at the barracks in St John's Wood. They're being shaved, they're being trimmed, they're being polished in preparation for what they say will be the biggest day of their lives. They'll leave here at about 10 o'clock this morning. They've been up since 6 o'clock, so already they'll be 4 hours into their day, and they will pull those 6 Royal Artillery guns down to Hyde Park, where there will be a 41-gun salute at noon. That, of course, formally starts the Queen's Diamond Jubilee year. Now, this is also an important day for the troopers and the horses here, because this is the last time they'll be at this barracks. Once they go out of the barracks here at 10 o'clock, they won't come back, because this site has reached the end of its lease. It's going to be sold and redeveloped. So quite a big day at 10 o'clock. They're expecting a lot of local people, school children, residents, also many veterans to be lining the route from here in St John's Wood down to Hyde Park. Now, once that 41-gun salute has taken place, they will then go on to their new barracks, which is where the guns originally came from in Woolwich in East London. So a very significant, a very poignant day for the troopers and the animals here today.
All right, Richard, thanks very much. I have to say, I've never seen, Richard, a horse being shaved before parade.
Neither is he, by the way. Thank you very much.
Damn, this is one about take a nibble right back there.
Got to get rid of that 9 o'clock shadow, haven't you? Thank you very much.
Richard, thanks very much. And exactly 60 years to the day since King George VI died and Princess Elizabeth became Queen.
Well, to mark the formal start of the Diamond Jubilee year, the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery will perform a special salute in London this morning. Our reporter Richard Slee joins us from the barracks in St John's Wood in London, where the horses are being prepared. Hello, Richard.
Yes, Sian, there are 109 horses here being thoroughly prepared for what they say is going to be the most important day of their life. They've been up since 6 o'clock, and since then they've been through a constant grooming regime. They've been plucked, they've been trimmed, they've been shaved, and all so that they look their absolute best to pull these rather wonderful 6 horse guns down to Hyde Park. And they have to be there at 12 o'clock, because that's when the 41-gun salute will take place, which will, of course, formally start the Queen's Diamond Jubilee year. Now, with me is the unit's CO, Major Mark Edward. Mark, just run us through what's going to happen today.
I mean, as you've said, it's a historic day, and it's a huge honour for us to be part of it. And quite literally, the 41-gun salute that we will fire in Hyde Park at noon marks the opening salvo of Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee year. As you can imagine, an awful lot of work goes into this. The soldiers prepare the horses and the equipment to a very high standard, so an early start this morning, but in fact progressive training throughout the year to enable us to deliver the spectacle that is the Royal Salute.
And it's not just a big day because of this event. It's the last day you're going to be here as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's a very fitting occasion for a new chapter in the history of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. There have been elements of a Royal Regiment of Artillery here since the early 1800s, and in fact the King's Troop has existed here in its current form since 1947. But the lease on this site, it's not owned by the MOD, it's leased from the Heir Estate. The lease will expire next month, so we move to purpose-built facilities in Woolwich, and we've inherited some really great facilities there. They will be a perfect working environment for my soldiers and providing for all the equine welfare requirements of the horses as well. So a bright new future for us.
A lot of people gathering here. It's going to be a big send-off, isn't it?
It is a very big send-off indeed. I mean, we've invited back all former members of the unit. So initially we will have the military farewell with our current serving members, their friends, family and former members here, before moving to the High Street, where we have an enormous send-off from the local community. We're incredibly lucky with the support and strength of feeling that we've enjoyed here, and we're really looking forward to what will no doubt be an excellent send-off from the local community later today.
Lovely. I hope you have a very good day today, and that big send-off will take place at 10 o'clock this morning.
That she and her husband have received over the past 60 years. She says they've been deeply moved by the many kind messages about the Diamond Jubilee. She goes on, "In this special year, as I dedicate myself anew to your service, I hope we will all be reminded of the power of togetherness and the convening strength of family, friendship and good neighbourliness. The Queen, who attended church yesterday at Sandringham, also says this Jubilee year is a time to give thanks for the great advances that have been made since 1952, and as we join together in the Diamond Jubilee, to look forward to the future with what she calls a clear head and a warm heart. It's a declaration of intent from a monarch 60 years on the throne who remains as committed as ever to the fulfilment of her duty. Later this week she'll return to Buckingham Palace, where the planning for the Diamond Jubilee programme of events is continuing apace. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News at Sandringham.
Well, the young Princess Elizabeth was staying in the Treetops Lodge in Kenya when she learned of the death of her father. Let's cross now to our correspondent Will Ross, who joins us from there this morning. Morning, Will.
Good morning. Yes, a very special spot. This not far from Mount Kenya, and of course extraordinary history right here. Behind me is the very spot where a tree house was located back in 1952.
In a special message to mark the 60th anniversary of her accession to the throne, the Queen has said she's deeply moved by the support for her Diamond Jubilee.
It's 60 years to the day since King George VI died and Princess Elizabeth became Queen at the age of just 25. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
In her accession day message, the Queen, who's pictured in 2 special Diamond Jubilee photographs published today, expresses her gratitude for what she calls the wonderful support and encouragement.
Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip stayed in that treehouse. We understand they spent many hours on a viewing platform, looking down at a large watering hole, at large herds of elephant and buffalo and rhinoceros also came down to the watering hole, and they enjoyed that time. Now, of course, this place has such history because of what happened on that night of the 5th of February. We know that the Princess and Prince